Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're taking on a case that's really stayed with people, even decades later. The Menendez brothers. Yeah, even if you just kind of remember it from the news, it's one of those stories that sticks with you.
Yeah, you're right. It gets under your skin, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, you've got wealth, privilege, accusations of abuse, and it makes you think about families and, well, the whole justice system. Things we're still figuring out even now.
totally. It's like everyone has an opinion on this case. So we're going deep, using some interesting sources this time. We've got excerpts from this new YouTube video essay, and it's taking on that Netflix series, Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story.
Which is interesting timing, right? Because that series caused a stir with how it showed everything.
Exactly. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind. Think late 1980s, picture Beverly Hills, but not just any house. We're talking a mansion. Like previously owned by Michael Jackson and Elton John kind of mansion. This is where Jose and Kitty Menendez lived. He was a Cuban immigrant, made it big as an entertainment executive. She was a former beauty queen. You can already see the headlines, can't you?
The whole American dream image, right? At least from the outside. But when you start digging, things get a lot more complicated.
Always. Okay, so they've got these two sons. Lyle, the older one, was at Princeton. But even there, he had problems. We're talking academic probation, even got suspended for plagiarism, or so the story goes. Makes you wonder about the pressure he was under.
Especially with a father like Jose,
Mm.
right? The YouTube video really paints him as this super driven, really demanding guy. Can you imagine those expectations?
And then there's Eric, the younger brother, total tennis star, nationally ranked and all. But he's described as, I don't know, more emotional, sensitive maybe, especially compared to Lyle, who is more, kept it together. The video really shows how different these two were, and they're both dealing with their parents' success, or maybe the shadow of it.
And that's where the cracks in this perfect family thing start to show. Because later on, the brothers would claim they'd been abused by their father for years.
And they didn't hold back. They said the abuse was so bad, so horrific, that it led them to do something truly unthinkable. But that's the big question, isn't it? Would a jury believe them? Would those accusations, even if true, excuse what happened? That's at the heart of this whole case. And this is where the story goes from kind of off to seriously messed up. It's August 20th, 1989. In the days before, the brothers, they do some things that are, well, chilling, to say the least. The YouTube essay points out how they drove all the way to San Diego just to buy shotguns.
Which is a hike, right? It's not like they could just walk down the street in Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
The video makes a big deal about how they were trying to avoid being recognized, and that definitely adds to the whole premeditation argument the prosecution used later.
Exactly. This wasn't just like an impulse buy. They were buying weapons. And not just any weapons, we're talking 12-gauge shotguns. And get this, they used fake IDs. Can you imagine going into a store buying something like that with a fake name? What do you even think about in that moment?
It's a lot to unpack. I mean, gun control was so different back then. It does seem like it was way easier to get your hands on these kinds of guns. But it's not even just the guns themselves, right? It's the level of planning that's so creepy.
The essay really hits on that. They even bought tickets to see Batman that same night, like last-minute alibi attempt. That little detail, those movie tickets, that becomes a key piece of evidence later on. So that night, totally unaware of what their sons are up to, Jose and Kitty Menendez are just hanging out in their den. Like a normal evening.
It's almost like, I don't know, Shakespearean or something. This super normal thing right next to this awful thing that's about to happen. The sources say Jose was probably watching TV, maybe a basketball game, and Kitty was reading. Or maybe even asleep in her chair.
Just a regular night. And then, boom, everything changes. According to what we know, the brothers come into the den, and without a word, Lyle sheets Jose. Point blank, right in the back of the head. The YouTube video, it talks about how brutal it was, how even the crime scene photos were too much to show publicly.
It's hard to even imagine that kind of violence. And it doesn't stop there. Kitty wakes up when she hears the shots and she tries to run. Can you imagine that moment when you realize what's going on?
It's chilling. Absolutely chilling. The essay describes how Eric actually chased his own mother through the house, firing over and over as she's trying to get away. They say she was shot almost a dozen times. That image, it sticks with you.
It shows you how intense it was, how much emotion, how out of control. But then things shift again. After the murders, the brothers, they staged the scene. They try to make it look like a mob hit. They even reloaded the shotguns, scattered shells around.
Like they're trying to distance themselves, create a story where someone else is responsible, and then the 911 call. I listened to the audio from that night. It's eerie. You can hear Lyle. He sounds distraught, even sobbing as he tells the operator he found his parents shot.
Talk about a performance. Knowing what we know now, it's hard to believe anyone could fake grief like that. But at the time, it worked. The police show up, they see everything, hear Lyle's story, and they don't immediately suspect the brothers.
They had their alibi, those Batman tickets, plus back then, forensics weren't what they are now. The YouTube video even says the police didn't even check their hands for gunshot residue.
Can you imagine that happening today? It shows how much things have changed. But even without the forensics, something about how the brothers were acting after, it just didn't sit right with investigators. They weren't acting like sons who had just lost their parent.
They were spending money. I mean, a lot of money. Yeah. And not just like treating themselves, but full-on spending sprees. The YouTube video goes into detail about how they bought luxury watches, a Porsche, even invested in a restaurant. I mean, they blew through something like $700,000 in 6 months. It's crazy.
It is wild. And it's that contrast, right? They're supposed to be these grieving sons, but then they're out there living large. Yeah. Huge red flag for the prosecution,
Yeah.
But what really took them down, what shattered their story, it came from Eric himself.
Yeah, it's really unexpected. He starts seeing this therapist, Dr. Ozol, to deal with the trauma of supposedly finding his parents murdered.
And here's where it gets ethically complicated, legally messy. So Eric doesn't know this, but Dr. Ozol is recording their sessions, including the one where Eric confesses to the murders.
Whoa. Can you imagine? Going to therapy, pouring your heart out, and it's all being recorded. The whole idea of privacy, confidentiality, it all goes out the window.
No kidding. And that's exactly what everyone argued about during the trial. Should those tapes even be allowed? On one hand, you've got a confession to a double murder. On the other hand, it was said during therapy. It's a tough one.
The YouTube essay really gets into this whole debate. People were divided back then. Some said those tapes should have never seen the light of day.
Shows you how tricky the justice system can be. When do you say, okay, we need to find the truth, versus people deserve their privacy, especially in that setting, And then you add court TV to the mix.
Right. Like before true crime was even a thing, this was the case to follow. Everyone was glued to their TVs, watching every little detail.
Totally inescapable. The brothers' faces were everywhere. Newspapers, magazines, everyone had an opinion, arguing about it at work, at dinner, you name it. It was huge.
And the trial itself, that just takes it to another level. You've got Leslie Abramson, their defense attorney. She becomes this legal star. Their argument was that the brothers were driven to this, that the murders were because of years of abuse from their father.
Their story was that Jose was a monster, basically. Physically abusive, mentally, even sexually. And that Kitty, their mother, she either couldn't or wouldn't protect them. It was a complete 180 from the prosecution's story of cold-blooded murder for money.
The classic, he said, she said, but with $14 million on the line. The YouTube video does a good job showing both sides. You hear about the abuse, but then you remember how they were spending money after. It's hard to know what to think.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. There's no easy answer. The first trial, it actually ended with a hung jury. Can you imagine being in that room?
No way. Talk about a case that gets at, the core of human nature, How do you decide who's guilty or innocent when it's this complicated?
Right. And the story doesn't even end there. So they have the second trial, and this time, the abuse defense, it's basically shut down, and the verdict changes, guilty of first-degree murder.
Wow. Sentenced to life, no parole. That's it, you're done.
It makes you think, even if you're not sure what to believe, that's a heavy sentence.
The weight of the justice system right there. No going back. And yet, even in prison, their story keeps going. They were apart for over 20 years, but then, get this, they're reunited in the same prison back in 2018. What a moment that must have been. Brothers, tied together by this horrible thing, seeing each other after all that time. It's almost a side note in a case full of side notes. And of course, people are still talking about it, even more so with the Netflix series and all the buzz around that. It makes you wonder, how much do these shows, these documentaries, how much do they color our perception of what really happened, of who Lyle and Eric Menendez really are?
That's the thing, isn't it? It's like the real story gets mixed up with how it's told, and you can't pull them apart. Are they victims, pushed too far by unimaginable abuse? Or are they manipulative, willing to do anything for money? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. That's what makes this whole case, even all these years later, such a trip.
A total trip. and one that leaves you with more questions than answers. We'd love to hear what you think. What side are you on? Hit us up on social media, keep the conversation going, and remember, sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that don't have a simple answer. Until next time, keep asking those questions and keep diving deep.